Hello, and welcome to our newest series, HR Heroes, where we will be interviewing inspirational executives who are champions and heroes across the HR space. Whether leading a global transformation program, scaling world-class startups to IPO, or engaging with executive boards, we'll be looking to tell the story of the journey and the lessons learned along the way. Hi, Charlotte. Thank you so much for joining me today. Looking forward to this conversation around scaling businesses, scaling teams. I know you've had a lot of experience in that space and we've spoke about it a few times. So looking forward to diving a little bit deeper into that and a bit more on your career history as well. So thanks again. Looking forward to this. Do you want to start out, Charlotte, and maybe give us and the listeners a quick introduction on yourself, a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you studied, and quick intro into your career as well?
Yeah, perfect. So Charlotte Forsyth, I'm a proud Brummie now, living in North London. Proud mum of two girls, and obviously live with my husband and our pet cat Lola. In terms of what I studied, so I did both my BA Honours in History at Nottingham University a long, long time ago. And then about 10 years later, did my MSc in HR Management at the London School of Economics. In terms of how I've got to where I've got to, it's quite a well-trodden path, I think, from kind of starting in recruitment and then sort of making the move over to being more of a business partner. I like to think that I kind of sit somewhere in the middle of a Venn diagram between having worked at really large organisations like sort of HSBC, WPP, sort of Meta for a short time, but then also having taken that knowledge, working in really large sort of organisations through to rapidly scaling startups. So I'm on my fourth sort of scale up or build type sort of role sort of now. And yeah, I really enjoy just sitting, as I said, in the middle of that sort of Venn diagram. The organisations that I've worked for in the last 10, 12 years have all been very sort of focused on, I guess what I call like behavioural psychology. So market research, media, sort of social, sort of radio. So why people engage with the content that they do, why do they engage with the brands that they buy? So I think just from an intellectual curiosity, again, sitting somewhere in the middle of tech, media, creative, more latterly AI, it's just been a really exciting journey.
Amazing. Yeah. I think I bet over the last few years that's changed quite a lot as well, right? With obviously the advancements in social media, data, insights, all that kind of thing. How the consumer
Definitely.
has changed. We're so demanding now, right? How quickly we want our stuff and how we interact with brands. So it must be quite, interesting to watch that change over the last few years.
Yeah, definitely. And the last two organisations I've worked in have been sort of AI driven. I know everybody says they're AI driven sort of now, but we are generally. So understanding in real time why consumers engage with the brands that they do, why they make the purchases that they make. And certainly kind of at my current organisation, having sort of patented AI technology that can tell brands in real time, who's kind of buying their brands, where they're more likely to get a conversion or a sale, and helping brands sort of pivot and kind of really get that optimization is really exciting.
Cool. Super interesting. Perfect. Well, let's dive into it then. Thanks for that. So obviously you've got quite a lot of experience in a combination of different businesses from, as you say, large enterprises through to the scale ups. And I think the scale up world has been, it's been a turbulent couple of years, right? We've seen huge growth. We've then seen layoffs across different firms, and different industries have been hit in different ways. So you've probably been in quite a few different scenarios where you've seen successes and probably challenges in that.
Yeah.
But for you, Charlotte, what kind of indicators need to be present for a company to kick off large kind of recruitment drives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think kind of in my experience, when you're looking to kick off a large recruitment drive, you've got to have a number of indicators sort of in place. So first of all, what actually is the talent attraction or acquisition sort of strategy? Have you done your workforce planning? Do you understand what skills that you need sort of not just sort of now, but in the future? And so essentially, where are you now? Where do you want to get to? And what does that gap look like? And ultimately, how do you bridge that gap? And that could be through buying talent in, and I guess that's your external talent acquisition sort of strategy. So on that, you need to be really clear, not just who who are you going after, what talent, what skills, but where are they? So, for example, a previous organisation that sort of I worked at, we were a scale up. We've got a fantastic employer sort of brand story, but it didn't actually kind of align with our sort of internal values. And I can kind of come on to that piece in a second. The other piece that was really challenging and probably more relevant kind of for this question, though, from a talent acquisition perspective, is that we were essentially fishing in the wrong pools. So we were, because we're sort of scaling fintech, we were looking for people who perhaps had worked at the large financial sort of institutions. So people were coming in expecting a certain level of maturity and process in place. And the reality was very different. We were very sort of manual, quite held together with sticky tape in the background. And it just meant that we saw people sort of coming in and with them expecting to have perhaps a large team, they'd be kind of directing the traffic, as I sort of say, whereas the reality was actually, it's just you, and we need you to have delivered that yesterday, and you're probably gonna have to wade through quite a lot of manual stuff to kind of get there. So kind of that sort of alignment was completely wrong. So what we actually ended up doing was recruiting quite a few people from the betting and gambling sort of industry, because like money remittance, so essentially sort of payments on app, as we were, that's a very price sensitive sort of industry. You are normally one of 4 competing apps on a customer's phone. It is regulated, like sort of fintech is as well, and people just tend to be much more used to that sort of pace, having to drive things, having to kind of navigate your way through sort of ambiguity. So that was kind of one of the quite significant shifts that we made with our talent acquisition sort of strategy, to make sure that not only were we recruiting people in, but actually they were staying and they were having that experience that kind of the employer brand sort of promised them. So that's a kind of talent acquisition sort of piece that you need to have sort of in place. There's then everything in terms of not just sort of make sure you're fishing in the right pools, but again, what is that sort of proposition? So when we set up the Poland office at LoopMe, which is where I am sort of now, again, we were going into a market to where we got no brand presence. People didn't know who we were. We hadn't necessarily done any sort of salary benchmarking, any benefits benchmarking. I hadn't even got a recruiter who sort of spoke Polish. We were trying to do it sort of from abroad. So kind of coming in and sort of focusing on that sort of as one of the first things that I needed to sort of very rapidly had to look at, well, not only who are we going after in terms of who we're recruiting, and ultimately it was kind of engineers and data scientists. So the Krakow market is very good for that. So that bit was okay. But we had just got no real sort of handle in terms of what is the narrative, what is the promise, the employer sort of brand piece. So making sure you've got all of your story lined up as well. So not just kind of your values and where you attracting your talent from, but making sure what are they coming to? What's the promise? What's the benefit, I guess. And I think once we got, and it sounds so simple, but once we got kind of a recruiter who knew the Polish market, spoke Polish in place, we hired a senior leader to help us really kickstart sort of that recruitment as well, because he was a bit of a figurehead that people wanted to come and sort of work for. We knew our position to market in terms of salary and total comp and benefits, and just really kind of leveraging all our sort of social sort of posts as well as our own sort of networks to really drive that sort of attraction sort of piece.
Makes sense. So kind of, as you say, having all your ducks in a row before going for it across both
Exactly.
setup and team structure, and I suppose where, as you mentioned, like where you want to get to, where you are now as well. The employee branding is totally important, and I think you're right. I've seen it a lot with businesses where what candidates think they're joining, and then what they end up taking part in, it's ends up being fruitless for everyone, right? Because they've spent money on recruitment or time or energy, resource. They've also then hired someone in, and it's, they've spent time trying to get them up and running, and it's not worked out. So definitely agree with you that, having those pieces in place in the beginning helps longer term. You kind of alluded a little bit, but what sort of mistakes have you seen companies make when they've purely focused on just speed of hiring?
So this is it, right? This is what I call, I guess, the scaling sustainably sort of piece. So scaling at pace is very much that sort of recruiting, bringing sort of external sort of talent in, and obviously you can scale that way, but you have to be able to scale sustainably as well. And what I mean by that is that you still need to sort of understand all your data points in terms of not just who are you attracting and why are people sort of joining you, but ultimately why do they stay? Why do they leave? How do you get them to sort of perform, scale themselves, sort of have a great sort of employee experience? And certainly the two of the previous startups that I've worked for, that has been sort of the real challenge. And that's where my whole sort of thinking around scaling at pace, but also scaling sustainably started to take form, I guess. So, like I said, you can scale at pace and recruit. But if you're not focused on actually engaging, developing, retaining those people, and I'm going to sound very brummy here, but you're essentially just filling up a leaky bucket. And that was my experience at a previous sort of organization. So I joined as chief people officer. All the leadership team kept telling me, right, we've got 36% voluntary attrition. Recruitment's broken, everybody's leaving because recruitment's broken. Now, I don't think anybody has ever left an organisation because they weren't recruited fast enough. So I sort of said to the leadership team, just give me a minute. Literally, this is day 2, day 3. I'm not going to kind of sort of make a decision immediately. I need to look at kind of all the data. So can I make recruitment go faster, reduce our time to hire, reduce our spend on external agencies, be more aligned to the different teams within the business rather than being generalists? Can I put priorities in place? Absolutely. And I did. But when you've got 36% voluntary attrition and half of those people are leaving with less than 1 year's service, that's not a recruitment issue, that's a retention issue, or possibly even a leadership issue. And that was kind of the pushback to the business, really, in terms of let's just actually look at our data points. And also, by the way, you should care about this because you spent $9 million in a year on the salary of people who have joined and left within a year. So again, a huge leaky bucket to be filling up. And as I said, this was kind of sort of part of the challenges that I saw that, as I've said already, we were kind of fishing in the wrong pools. We were recruiting people coming in expecting one thing in terms of being a much more mature, process-driven organization, and actually sort of the pace and the demands placed on them personally was not what they expected.
Yeah.
The other piece that was a challenge as well was that, as I said, we've got an amazing brand in terms of our sort of founder's story, a very mission-driven organisation in terms of helping economic migrants, part of the diaspora, send money back home to their loved ones, their communities. So we also had a group of people joining us who expected us to be more like a charity. And again, we absolutely were not. So I had to do a lot of work with the CEO and the leadership team, understanding from employees, candidates who had joined us, and also those who hadn't. Looking at our competitors, ultimately, what is our value prop? And we kind of came up with almost 3 pillars. That we said, right, this is what everything hangs from in terms of what you give, but also what you get. And they were pace, impact, and exposure. So we will absolutely give you kind of that sort of fast-paced sort of environment, but ultimately we expect you to kind of want to be part of it. We can give you that opportunity to have impact. We're a real mission-driven sort of organization in terms of helping customers achieve their economic ambitions, but ultimately you need to have that impact as well. You're not just here to direct the traffic. And exposure, even though we grew to 1,600 people by the time that I left from sort of 800, we were a very flat organisation. So, you could have that sort of exposure to the senior leadership team. But again, you need to want to own it and to sort of drive it. So kind of being really clear about what were those 3 pillars. This is who we are. This is who we're not. We're not for everybody, but that's
Sure.
okay. But actually, if we are for you, this is actually the experience that we can give you. And I guess the impact of that ultimately was sort of reducing our voluntary attrition from 36% to 15, 16. We had gone into COVID by that point, so ultimately that did play a bit of a part. However, I think the real litmus test for me was that when we came out of the first lockdown and the first sort of, wave of recruitment kind of came back, actually we still held our voluntary attrition down to sort of 16, sort of 18 sort of percent then. So the fact that when the job market came back, we didn't actually see loads of people sort of leave. In fact, we were really clear about sort of this is who we are, this is who we're going to recruit, this is how we also retain and develop as well. Because ultimately, I'd kind of walked into a business that had hired 600 people the year before, and more than half of those were replacements. And again, that's the scaling at pace piece, but it's not scaling sustainably. Because again, you're just filling up that leaky bucket.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's some super interesting points that you raised there. And I think even though you alluded to the pandemic time, where yes, perhaps in the first instance, people probably stayed put, there was definitely a huge drive, especially in the kind of scale up tech world. I can't even remember where it was lockdown 1, 2, whatever. But the job market was booming, right? And there was a lot of movement. So to say that you were able to retain it at that point, I think is actually pretty impressive.
Yeah, and we were still scaling at pace as well. Like all through COVID, we were still sort of growing. At one point, even sort of 80% year on year, because that
Wow.
again was one of the benefits of being digital. Our customers weren't relying on having to go into a high street branch to be able to send
Yeah.
sort of money back home. And again, there's a real mission piece that comes into play then because it certainly starts to get very real when you realize that you're helping sort of people, whether in sort of London, sort of UK, America, sort of wherever, sort of sending money back home to their communities across Southeast Asia and Africa, because they are also in lockdown and need to get sort of food and provisions and everything. So there was a huge mission piece that I think we were really able to use to kind of engage and sort of unite people sort of with. So we were still hiring, even during lockdown, the average sort of 1.5 people per day, all through sort of that 18 months sort of period. So yeah, huge growth. But as I said, the scaling at pace means nothing if you can't scale sustainably as well.
Absolutely. And just on that, so I guess as any business grows, right, the company culture evolves.
Yeah.
So I suppose there's challenges at probably big milestones throughout, but how have you seen or how have you implemented positive results when scaling the company culture during those times of building new teams?
Yeah, well, this is it, right? Kind of it gets even harder when everyone's remote, and you perhaps have that sort of lack of connection or perhaps slightly more sort of isolated. So again, I think it all just comes back to kind of your values. So if you've built that external sort of facing employer brand and you're very clear about sort of the values that it hangs on, you've then got to, again, as I said, have that match up to the internal sort of piece. So I think if all your people processes align to your values, then you're able to scale your culture sort of that way. Because ultimately it means, wherever you are sat in the world or in the business, whether you're in an office, whether you're remote, you should be having the same consistent employee experience. So, if one of your values, for example, is about sort of diversity and inclusion, but actually all your people processes don't align to that, again, that's going to feel quite mismatched for people. And again, that's going to drive a lack of engagement. It'll drive your retention sort of up. I think the other piece as well, and I do want to give a shout out actually to Hannah Burke, who I work with at World Remit, who's, I believe now Internal Comms Director at Legal in General, possibly the best internal comms person I've ever worked with. I am not a comms expert, but
Yeah.
people and culture tend to be quite high users of comms. And I think kind of what I learned from her is just making sure sort of with your internal comms, everything keeps coming back to the why and the sort of purpose and the message. So every single piece of internal comms Hannah would send out all came back to doing the right thing for the customer. So even if it was a really hard message that we had to put out, which we did in COVID, we took the decision to delay paying bonuses by a month. I think in the second lockdown, just to obviously sort of make sure we had enough to keep the organisation kind of going. But and that was a really, really difficult message to people, especially when they've been working really hard again in lockdown. Yeah, I think your kind of concept of working hours shifted slightly in COVID because we were all just sort of sat on our laptops because what else was there to do? But even with really, really difficult messages, everything came back to this is about doing the right thing for our customer. And we need to make sure our customers can actually send money back home to their communities sort of first. So yeah, shout out to Hannah because I've genuinely learned a lot from her.
Amazing. And yeah, as you say, like ensuring that people feel like their job is part of a bigger thing, right? So yeah, I feel like it brings back the point of purpose. Yeah, really like that point. What sort of data sets do you think are important or have been critical to you when advising C-levels on future growth plans? Of course, when you're at the beginning phases and it's a super small business, it's probably quite easy to look at that. But as any business gets bigger, right, it's important to assess and look at. So what kind of data points would you look at, Charlotte, and why?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think from a data perspective, HR sometimes sits on a lot of data, but they don't necessarily share it, which really frustrates me. And again, I think kind of starting my early career at HSBC, when the whole concept of people analytics started to sort of come through, and actually using your data to be able to cut through the noise was really, really important. And again, really fortunate to work under sort of Mark Sheridan, who I think kind of retired a year or so ago, who really transformed the business partner role in terms of us being able to be much more commercially focused, much more consultative, storytellers, but also the use of data, because otherwise there's so much noise and it's really difficult to kind of cut through that. So I think in terms of data, again, there's two sort of sides to it. There's a talent attraction sort of strategy sort of piece. So again, sort of understanding what skills you need in the future, where do you get them from? Again, if you're here and you want to get to there, what does that gap look like? And again, that's the whole buying talent in piece. But then there's also the internal building talent up to sort of fill that gap and those roles. And if I take kind of LoopMe as a sort of the most recent example, again, when I joined, I wanted to get quite forensic in terms of, well, actually, why have we got, I think, 21% sort of voluntary sort of attrition? Kind of what's driving that? Because again, you can't scale with that level of voluntary attrition, especially when I looked into it in more detail. About 90% of all our leavers from the previous 18 months had all been in revenue generating roles. Now, obviously, it's not great to lose any talent, but if you're losing your revenue generating sort of folks, the people that you need to kind of get on board, get ramped up quite quickly, start bringing obviously sort of the accounts in and stuff. That's not great either. So kind of combining that data set with actually our internal engagement survey data, and again, I was telling quite a compelling story in terms of our leavers. The number one reason our leavers were leaving us was perceived lack of sort of career development. Our internal engagement surveys were telling us that that was kind of the number one driver, not just of engagement, so how high do people sort of rate things, but also retention. So I think it's always important with engagement surveys to split out the actual engagement score, but then what I call your employee net promoter score, because that's but does it make any difference? So the so what? So for example, time and time again, you always get people rating their relationship with their immediate line manager really highly. However, it makes no difference on their sort of intention to stay. So you've got to kind of separate that out sort of with the sort of engagement data, because there's the sort of the what, but also the so what as well. Actually, what our sort of retention, sort of intention to stay data was actually telling us was that the thing that drove people the most was they wanted to have those career conversations. They wanted to understand, what does that next step look like? How do I get there? How are you going to enable me to do so? What do you expect from me to be able to do it? Because all of our data was telling us that our people wanted to feel like they were contributing, they wanted to feel like they were getting that development and recognition sort of in return. So again, that was the whole scaling sustainably sort of piece and that sort of, I was able to get buy-in from the C-suite on in terms of all the interventions we then put in place around competency frameworks, career development frameworks, really doubled down on line manager capability with everything to do with performance growth, coaching conversations. So again, sort of in terms of data sets, I do think HR sits on a lot of data and doesn't necessarily share it or do anything with it. You've got to, I think, sort of understand, where are you now, where do you want to get to, and use all the data points that you've got to understand, well, do you buy the talent in, do you build it up?
Absolutely. And I guess as you get bigger and bigger as a company, then there's perhaps more room, depends on the business, but for bringing in a specialist to do that, right? Because maybe if that's not your kind of wheelhouse, then fair enough. But as you mentioned, your time at HSBC and kind of really pushing further into people analytics, it's for some businesses, it's still quite nuanced. So maybe bringing in a specialist is also, even if it's not permanently, like probably time and place for it.
Yeah, definitely.
How about like the employee experience? So you alluded when it was lockdown, it's difficult to have the exact same kind of candidate or employee experience once someone joins. But have you had any examples where you've successfully embedded a kind of a consistent employee experience across when scaling at pace and sustainably?
Yeah, it is that consistency sort of piece, as you said. So again, if I think back to my time at World Remit, sort of in lockdown, a huge enabler of that consistent employee experience was actually our line managers. So again, kind of being really clear with managers in terms of this is what we kind of expect, because I don't think organisations are always that good at doing it in terms of explaining to somebody, right, congratulations, you're now a manager. This is what's different. This is what
Yeah,
we expect of you, but this is what you can expect of us. We also really doubled down on the mental health sort of piece as well. And actually, one of the most beloved, successful benefits that we introduced was actually our quarterly recharge day. So
yeah,
once a quarter, you had the opportunity to just take a day for yourself, and really sort of focus on kind of your mental health, whatever that sort of looked like. And I remember actually going into battle with some of my SLT colleagues who wanted people to pass their probation, sort of first of all, before they were eligible for it. I was like,
yeah,
absolutely not. Right, my role as a leader, although I've got particular specialism or lens on the people piece, kind of in my role as a leader, I strongly believe that actually joining a new organization and in lockdown, it's hard enough joining an organization sort of anyway. It's pretty sort of
yeah,
stressful at times, but doing it kind of in lockdown when you're not actually sort of meeting people, having that sort of connection sort of with your colleagues. And I was like, absolutely not. I think people need it in their probation period when they're scaling up and ramping up themselves sort of even more. And it's funny, it's just like, I know it's just an extra day a quarter, but people absolutely loved it. Thinking about consistent sort of employee experience, consistent is sort of that word. It's about making sure that everything is kind of aligned to your values. We obviously said that we were really caring about our team's mental health in sort of lockdown, and we sort of showed up through our line managers and driving that consistent experience through them, but also making sure that we were really focusing on everything we were doing from a mental health perspective as well.
absolutely. And I think with those type of initiatives, it probably sounds quite scary at first, especially for maybe the leadership team, as you said, but you probably get quite a lot back without realizing it. And the loyalty,
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, ultimately you're getting a bit more efficiency out of someone if they've had a bit of a, as you say, recharge day, come back stronger. So
Especially in lockdown, right?
yeah,
People working so hard. And again, I was like, we need to recognize that.
yeah. And taking like a proactive approach to it, I think is super powerful, especially at the time
Yeah.
it's competitive in the market and things like that.
I
Um,
think that's it with mental health. Like I said, it is being proactive with it in terms
mm,
of coming from a place of proactive mental well-being kind of first, as opposed to
mm.
reactive health and safety kind of after the fact type sort of thing.
Totally. Okay. There's the last question on that kind of scaling at sustainably and scaling at pace and consistently. Have you ever had a time where you've had to come in and totally transform a hiring strategy quickly? Whether you kind of built it and had to transform it or came into a business new? And if so, what would be the first priorities that you would attack?
So in terms of I guess transforming or rethinking a hiring strategy, probably one of the ones that I'm most proud of was probably at my time at sort of Wireless and News UK. So for Wireless, for people who don't know it, and you probably do, but sort of TalkSport, Virgin Radio, obviously sort of Talk Radio, and at the time we had, I think, about sort of 16 local radio stations as well. I am a massive sport and music fan, as you can probably tell. All the
Yeah.
song references and football references on sort of the wall, sort of behind me. So that was a bit of a dream come true job, to be honest, because again, just being so engaged in the product anyway. I don't look like your average talk sport listener, but I am. I listen sort of religiously. So yeah, being super engaged kind of in the product, but also being able to do my first build in terms of building sort of the HR team, building the hiring strategy. Because Wireless had pretty much nothing in place when I joined, it had just been acquired by News UK a couple of months beforehand. So that was kind of my remit actually, to come in and, like I said, do my first build job, having always worked at sort of large corporates beforehand. So a bit of a dream come true. However, you know, again, well told story. Our teams were very white, very male. Internships at the time in radio were pretty much unpaid. So from a privilege perspective, to be able to do an unpaid internship in central London, none of this sat right sort of with me, especially because when you looked at our three biggest audience sort of drivers, football, cricket, boxing, like three of possibly the most diverse sports in terms of sort of race, more latterly sort of gender. I'm absolutely delighted that sort of women's football's finally getting all the airtime sort of that it is. I did try to convince the content controller at the time to get netball on the radio. Never quite managed that, but no, but sort of huge sort of focus on those sports. And so in terms of our hiring strategy, what that meant was that we were sort of recruiting people who didn't necessarily always sort of align sort of with our audiences. And again, there's everything else that goes with that about not having a diverse or inclusive kind of workforce in terms of everything you miss out in terms of engagement, creativity, etc., etc. So in terms of kind of getting engagement from the leadership team, I really had to, I guess, kind of, again, think commercially, talk their language, and this was all about audiences.
Yeah.
And again, it's like we are recruiting people who do not reflect our audiences. The biggest piece, I guess, kind of there then was then actually sort of starting to work on creating a talksport sort of journalism sort of apprenticeship scheme. I was only actually there for kind of the infancy sort of that idea, or actually then sort of moved on to sort of Meta sort of after that. But again, kind of massive shout out to Laura Lane. She was Laura Petit, Laura Lane, who really sort of, we worked really closely together, both at sort of Wireless and then lastly at World Remit, and she really took that and kind of created, an award-winning sort of apprenticeship scheme. But again, this was all about, appealing to what the business most interested in was audiences, and our hiring strategy, who we were recruiting from a background, race, gender, privilege perspective, it just didn't match up kind of with the audiences and the sports that we were representing.
Amazing. That's super cool. And probably still a challenge now. And it depends, obviously, as you say, on the context, right? So that's radio and sort of sport focused. But I think that message probably holds true to most industries these days, right? And it's obviously quite contentious at the moment with what's happening in some of the big firms in the US around, unfortunately, maybe putting D&I agendas on the back seat. But the reality is, I think if you're true to your kind of ethos and missions, it's an important part of any hiring strategy. And you kind of need someone to be passionate about that, right? Cool. So you mentioned a couple of people so far. But are there any, I suppose, mentors that you've had during your career who've made a really, really strong impact on you? If so, who? And maybe they gave you this advice, but maybe not. What kind of advice have you received, or what was the best advice you received whilst regarding scaling journeys?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of people to shout out, and they'll probably hate the fact that I've done it, but I think in terms of best advice, if I start there, so possibly the best advice I was ever given was actually through Matthew Stone, who I've worked with on and off, gosh, probably for about 10, 12 years now. Matthew always used to joke that I'd always come to him with really kind of complex problems to fix, but he's absolutely amazing, whether it's individual coaching, whether it's team sort of interventions, in terms of really kind of getting under the skin of what's going on. He's so curious, and I absolutely love that. And I've definitely given him some very difficult individual and or team sort of problems to sort of help me fix, which he's done. But I always remember meeting him for a coffee when I'd first been promoted to HR director at Kantar. I'd just come back from maternity leave as well. So quite an overwhelming sort of experience. I was really proud of the fact and thankful to Kantar that, they even though I've just come back from mat leave, they sort of promoted me. And then again 6 months later. So amazing opportunity and support there. But I always remember Matthew's went sort of met for a coffee outside the Kantar building, More London Place. I was a bit like, oh, what do I do? Like, I never thought I'd be here or necessarily that I want to be here in terms of making up to sort of director level. And I was remember Matthew just looking me in the eye and saying, just remember, you are only effective through your delivery. So, and that's it kind of with HR. I think it's so easy to sort of focus on like 10,000 sort of things, and you can do all of them bar one really well, but it's always that one that you don't do well that people will remember. So I think kind of just having that sort of laser focus on priorities and delivery. And again, it's the so what and what next. And I think kind of also from my time at Kantar, sort of Ishbel Morrison, who I worked with, who's chief HR officer sort of at the time, again, she was very, very clear about the so what and what next. So don't just sort of tell the business the what. Like I said, it's what are you actually going to do with that sort of information. And again, that goes back to the whole piece about HR office sits on a lot of data, but what does it actually mean? What's the impact? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Etc. And then I guess kind of the last person who just thinks an incredible, fearless female leader, and I just generally just loved working with her was Jo Bucci, again, who worked with at Wireless. She was the COO there. Great support again to me when I came back from my second sort of mat leave. The other sort of senior female leader sort of in the business. Again, that's real sort of focus on what actually matters, cutting through the noise, ruthless prioritization. But she was also just a lot of fun to sort of work with.
Amazing. Cool. Amazing. Charlotte, that's super helpful. Like, so interesting. I love all the stories and experiences that you have, and I'm sure everyone's going to be interested in listening. So thanks for sharing. The last question is a fun one. Where's next on your vacation bucket list?
So I feel like I should probably say somewhere like the Maldives or Mauritius and just, staying in a beach hut on stilts in the sea. But the reality is with two little girls, that probably looks slightly different now. So I never ever thought I would say this, but actually where I really want to go next year is actually Disney World in Florida. Again, never ever thought I'd say that. But I think the reality is with my two girls being 7 and 10, it feels like time's running out sort of quite quickly to do holidays like that. Actually the other and again, never thought I'd want to necessarily go to Disney, but the other female leader that I've worked with that's really sort of shaped that actually was a current one. So Lisa Coffey, our Chief Revenue Officer at LoopMe, again, can just cut through the noise, really focused on sort of not just the commercials and those priorities, but also the people experience sort of too. So she's a great partner to work with, and again, lots of fun. And she actually had her US sort of sales offsite in Florida last year, and actually having a night walking around at the Epcot Centre on a random Tuesday in February, 27 degrees. As I said, I never ever thought I'd want to.
Doesn't sound too shabby.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. We did do some work, but yeah, kind of in terms of yeah, just sort of being there and thinking actually this yeah, this is probably somewhere I should bring my kids. So I never ever thought I would say that and be into the Disney magic, but here we are.
Nice. Oh, special. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for today. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure, like I said, everyone will be excited to tune in. So appreciate you sharing your story, and we will speak again soon. Sound good?
Amazing. Thank you so much.